Some progress finally being made in the death of Ellen Greenberg. Of course, this was ruled a suicide. The medical examiner not being able to be swayed, not changing anything after many attempts and many arguments. But now it is finally going to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to hear arguments on this. Jennifer Coffindaffer, retired FBI special agent. I know you've been covering this case quite a bit on your own podcast channels as well, and you've been covering it on Twitter for a very long time, even before that. What does this mean that it's going to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court? Can you explain that?
This is just monumental news. It's monumental news, first of all, because so many superior courts and states never accept cases of any nature, right? It's such a small percentage of what they'll even consider. So the fact that they got this accepted is amazing. And quite frankly, it delves around this entire argument regarding whether the parents had standing to present their case
Hmm.
against the ME. So it wasn't whether it was factually supported by evidence. In fact, the judges at the lower level said, they were appalled, really. I don't know if that was the exact word they used, but certainly that was intimated from the language they used that it was unbelievable what had happened in this case, but that the Greenbergs don't have standing. And so, for that reason, the Supreme Court is going to hear it. And of course, what the Greenbergs are hoping for is that the Supreme Court says, you know what? You do have standing. So go back to the lower courts. And yes, you're going to be able to make this case.
Because they weren't able to argue it yet in the lower court. So if there's a lot of possibilities of what can happen here, and this could even be precedent setting for even other cases as well, depending on what the Supreme Court says. But let me understand this correctly. If the Supreme Court says you do have standing, you can go back. Then it's not a okay. There's a death investigation that's on here. It's not immediately a murder investigation or undetermined. They have to go still make that argument then, but they're given the opportunity. Basically, they're given the ticket to go in, get it stamped, go on the ride, and see what the lower court says, correct?
That's exactly right. This was so strange to say that because there's a death that occurs and because you're not married to the person, in other words, you're the parents, that you don't have standing to present such a case really makes absolutely no logical sense. And I'm hoping, as you said, there is case precedent here because parents should be able for their children who have no other kin, if you will,
Mhm.
be able to make such an argument on their behalf, if you will.
Where do you think this goes? I mean, if the Supreme Court looks at this, which they're obviously going to, and if they say, yeah, you can take it back, but then it goes back to the lower court, and then we get back into the whole ecosystem that the Greenbergs have been dealing with for years or decades, really, at this point, that really have had no desire whatsoever to see things their way. I mean, do we just kind of could? I mean, we could end up at a stalemate again, really, couldn't we? If they just say, "Yeah, we'll hear you, but we're not." Come on in, la 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 la. Okay, great. Thanks for coming in. Bye bye. That's what I'm kind of fearing in this case, considering how many roadblocks they've already gone into on a case that's utterly ridiculous, as in having been ruled a suicide.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is that chance and concern by the Greenbergs, but I think there's a lot of hope. And I say that because of this long opinion that was issued by that lower court. And they were actually quite convinced that this should not have been determined as a homicide, excuse me, as a suicide. Recall, it was always determined to be a homicide until a meeting took place. And what that uh, ME essentially said was, I'm changing my mind strictly based on the fact that she was alone.
Hmm.
And the only reason they determined she was alone was based on the fiance, who was the chief, in my opinion, the chief potential subject, on his word.
Hmm. And that's where it's
So
at
yeah, and
forever.
that's where it's at. It's really mind-boggling also when you consider there was a knife change
Hmm.
in the middle of the quote unquote suicide. There were two weapons used. That's another reason why it always just jumped off the page to me as being ridiculous that you're in the middle of killing yourself and you're going to go to a different knife.
Hmm.
It makes sense if it's a homicide to me because you could be attacking somebody and it bend or break, or it's not achieving exactly what you're trying to achieve, so you grab the other knife right there on the counter and you continue with the murder.
Why? Well, there's so many questions in the case of Ellen Greenberg that make no sense whatsoever. When we talk about the what was it? It was like a 30 some stab wounds. What I forget, because it's
20.
20 some stab wounds into her, several in from behind. And there's some questions here. I'm going to play devil's advocate for 1 second. Some people argue, well, some of these stab wounds were very superficial, if they will. They didn't go in very far. It was kind of like, you jam it. Oh, that didn't go in. I'm going to keep going. Some made it further. Some didn't. It sounds like more than it really is, I guess, is kind of the argument that's been made. Is that a valid argument?
I don't think in this situation, because I believe 10 of those wounds are from the behind and a huge gash in her head.
Hmm.
And the trajectory to me just seems so completely off. If you reach your hand back, as you can do it yourself, you can see you would come in at a different angle than what we can see in the autopsy and in the photographic evidence. It's not uh, a clear back to front as these wounds appear to be. So that's number one. Number two, uh, I don't think that her fiance, if indeed he ends up being the one they charge, I certainly think he's the chief person they'll look at. Um, he probably had never I don't believe any information that he's ever stabbed anybody else in his
Hmm.
life, right?
Yeah.
So there is some sort of, when you haven't done this before, what kind of power is it going to take? What sort of force? What's your knife selection? Maybe that's why the knife selection was changed to the larger knife. I equate it to, and I don't know if you've ever had to give anybody a shot,
Hmm.
but when I first learned to give shots, and you're all sitting around learning, you do it soft at first
Sure.
because you don't really understand the force that's necessary to penetrate the muscle.
Hmm.
And then you realize, wow, I really have to give this a ton of force.
Hmm.
Again, in crimes of passion, usually you don't see any huge issues like that. But the other thing is, I've thought about, initially was a big knife used that caused these you know deaths, the wounds that caused her death, and then later was it staged as a suicide by lightly poking to try to bring home that concept,
Hmm.
that thought process, if you're trying to sort of manufacture that possibility. So I could see both scenarios. I think the second scenario I stated might make more sense.
And then you have the post-mortem stab wound as well, which,
Mhm.
I mean, is there room for error on that? Could they have been wrong on that determination where this wasn't post-mortem? I mean, obviously it stands out as it could have been a suicide if it's post-mortem, but obviously they ruled it a suicide. So is there a gray area on that where maybe the science isn't perfect every time? I don't know.
I don't think there can be a gray area because that wound that you're talking about, I believe, was literally in the spinal column.
Hmm.
And so just think how the spine, especially in these areas, which were the neck areas, kind of that top shoulder neck area, that controls your arms,
Yeah.
in that area, the C5, C6, C7. But in
There.
any event,
Yeah.
uh, it's, when anybody who looks at this photo of her wounds and exactly where they are, that is an image that's made very specifically from the autopsy and from those wounds. It's logic defying that she could do that. And as you said, it's been stated that one occurred and that there's others that are post-mortem,
Hmm.
which again defies logic.
I mean, we're talking about a suicide where someone stabbed themselves in the back about 10 times, post-mortem wounds and switches the knife. Has that ever happened in history? Have we ever seen a suicide like this anywhere ever, that where that's the course of action?
And then moves to the front. And I
Yes.
think it's also interesting to note that women typically, they really don't do things in suicide. I'm just saying typically that defaces them.
Hmm.
You'll see a lot of times pills that are taken, overdoses. You'll see the slitting of the wrist.
Hmm.
That again is not, and for the Greenbergs will tell you she had to have her makeup on to go to the grocery store. I have sisters like that.
Yeah.
They and a daughter. They look gorgeous, literally just to walk outside and get the mail.
Hmm.
And that is who Ellen Greenberg was as a person.
Yeah.
So again, it defies logic that somebody with this particular, modus operandi in her life would all of a sudden take a knife and just massacre her body.
Hmm. Hey, thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to follow us wherever you download podcasts, and especially Apple Podcasts, where you can get advanced episode and premium content on our premium channel right there. Also, be sure to follow us on social media so you don't miss any breaking updates on the stories that matter to you most. We're on TikTok, X, Instagram, Facebook. Just search Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Brueski, and you'll find us right there. Again, thanks for watching.